Welcome everyone to this forum. I'd like to just begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'm on Gadigal land here in Sydney, and of course the Gadigal people have taken care of this land on which Sydney is now built for countless generations. I'd like to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. This forum is part of a program which the Anthropocene Transition Network is presenting at the moment called Learning Change. Our ability to learn from our experience and adapt and apply that learning as rapidly as possible and to share it as widely as possible has really become a very important priority for our species.
Thank you, Kenneth, for this program. I'm very much enjoying it. And I'm sorry if I've missed it, but and perhaps, are there any intentional outcomes from this that have been reached for?
Not as such. As I said, we decided to embark upon this after a conversation with those 4 practitioners that you know about that are participating in the roundtables, and when we came together, we actually spoke about this group being a kind of a faculty, a collegiate group who were going to explore some questions together and see what emerged from that. I would very much hope, and I think the roundtable guests hope too, that there will be some ongoing questions and initiatives that will emerge out of this discussion. But let me say that we've all got quite a strong commitment to the notion of emergence, of stepping into a process and engaging with one another and seeing what emerges out of that process. Let's begin with the first group, which was the breakout room 1, which had Jane, Mari, Sarah, and Sheila in it. Would one of you like to say something about your discussion?
I'll just say that what Mari said in reference to Amanda's sort of position of being frustrated when people talk and don't get onto the action, and Mari from her Zen position said, well, who's to say which action is right? But I have to confess to my little group that I came out of the first round table more along the spectrum to Amanda's frustration than the other end. If that makes sense to our little group. And can I hand over to Jane or Sarah or Mari to say what came up in our group?
Well, looks like you're in the hot seat, Jane.
Sure. Well, we had some really, what was delightful was that we had some synergies going on between us, from Denmark to Sydney to Melbourne. What connected us, I think, was very Zen. And I think what came up was, see, now I'm going to forget what we actually talked about. A really interesting metaphor that came up was a tree, and thinking about how a tree is shaped by and shapes its environment. And so this was sort of an idea about systems thinking. How did that come up, Sarah?
So we were
We were talking about this idea that Amanda had come up with or mentioned in the meeting about the two different ways to approach change. One being to give me an issue and I'll try to solve it, and the other to redistribute power. And I was reflecting on how I felt like both of those were still kind of direct correctives or ways of like treating things like as if they're problems that we need to find like a pathology for or a solution for. And then that led to this idea of action versus talking. That was also what I think Sheila and you were reflecting on. And we just were basically brainstorming about, you know, this idea that, of course, if you try to directly solve complex challenges, that's kind of against the process of adaptation, which is what a tree would be doing. And if we recognize that, like that change, I think Tyson said it needs to be a spontaneous uprising. So if we recognize the fact that there needs to be this adaptive, authentic adaptation, then what's the alternative, right? Is it just non-action? And that's where we that's at least where I think if I wanted to try to blend our different perspectives together, that's where I would come to a conclusion. And we all agreed we like this movie called My Octopus Teacher. We recommend that to everybody.
Yes. You're muted.
Yes, I've just been unmuting myself. I think that, you know, I mean, it was very interesting the way that we found out that there were lots of sort of connections. And I mean, I think the thing that really struck me was that Sarah said about being so surprised that so many of us here in Australia seem to have some sort of connection with and interest in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues, because that's not something that happens in America. And it struck me as perhaps, I mean, you know, I think there are issues, obviously. We all know that things are not by any means perfect here. But I think the fact that we're increasingly listening to Indigenous voices is promising. And I was, yeah, so I think I'll just leave it there. And it's unusual in some, you know, compared with America, where people don't, I mean, for example, acknowledge the land that they're on or anything like that ever.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that obviously that's something that could be discussed quite a bit, but just to make a quick comment about it, in my observation, it's quite a recent thing. It's a significant change that's happening in Australia over really just the last few years, and it is a very important cultural shift that's happening here, I think. But nevertheless, 60% of white settler Australians have never met an Aboriginal person. So the connection is often not at a very personal level.
Absolutely, but I think that what's interesting is getting somebody else's perspective on things. Yes. That in itself is a valuable.
Yes.
Mm. Yeah. And it brought up, there was also a point that Nora had made, which was changing perception is a form of action.
Mm.
And, you know, that could be a personal perception that's changing, or a cultural, or, you know, as we think in systems, you know, it's a nested hierarchy of changing perception.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what is the renaissance of Indigenous culture in Australia is, you know, a path towards that changing perception. That was sort of where we got to.
Good. Okay. Well, let's go on to the room 2, which had Ali, Julie, Kylie, and Tony in it. Okay.
3 people had connections, and I'm new to the connection. It was really beautiful to observe people with a lot of synergy coming together when you've got a group of 30 people. So that's really lovely. I'd like to thank everybody for this initiation, because it's really nice to be in that place of conversation. Ali and Kylie beautifully gave us a synopsis of the call last week, which was really nice. Some of the synergies and sharing of the notes, and to feel and sense that as a living being in them, because it's still alive in them. So that as someone who's just coming in fresh is inspiring. And I find enthusing, because it shows that it's an ongoing movement. There was a lot of talk very much around systems, also from approaches. There was a lot of conversation around surrendering, leading with trust, the ability to not move into solution-oriented behaviour too fast, and which can be being brave enough to throw out all the precedented knowledge that we think we own, in order to create a new place where we can co-create it together, where it's not have to grab at owning stuff, so that we find this new way of in the nature analogy, where living is something new can be formed out of a disaster or some event that happens that cuts something off really fast. And we then also brought in that economic conversation, where economics around the world have been halted and disrupted in a very major way, and has not been by a natural occurrence, hasn't been a mudslide, or it hasn't been nature having to change its camouflage. It hasn't had this moment to be able to do that. So this how far away economics and the harmony of nature, how is a living beingness going to emerge in that way? And then the willingness and bravery of us to be able to, when I heard the word no, how, just then going, let's put that word how aside, what does that look like? And great question at the end asking us, what would our question be? And in the end we also used the glass jar analogy about being Tyson's idea about being the glass, and the pressures inside and outside, and that glass, what does that look like, the glass shattering? Would that look like, where the glass jar does no longer exist, and it goes back to its original form of sand? And the question at the end, I think Kylie ended up posing, listening to all of us, so what are the barriers, or what are the obstacles that are holding us back inside ourselves from surrendering all the past, from being with that bravery, stopping us going forward? Anybody else like to add to that? Beg your pardon?
Thank you very much. Yes, a very rich discussion, it sounds like. Does anybody else from that group want to add? Tony or Kylie or Ali?
Oh, I think that was an excellent summary, Julie. Thank you. Just to pull together that that last question that we talked about. It was associated as well with that distinction between, like our human-made systems and natural systems, and that we're so often coming in from the perspective of looking at things from within a human-made system. Mm-hmm. So it was that those might be sort of creating some of those blocks or barriers that that prevent us from being able to go with the changes that need to happen. So yeah, I thought it was a good question that we came up with at the end.
Do you want to just restate that question again?
Yeah, how are we stopping ourselves from making the changes?
Okay, and anybody else from that group want to add any comment?
I just wanted to say that yeah, it was a really great discussion, and that sorry, is that working?
Yes, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
But no, I just wasn't sure. But also that idea that we touched on briefly, that Tyson talked about, was the authority and power being separate, and how can we evolve into a sort of new way of being that is perhaps new, but referencing that ancient wisdom of First Nations knowledge about not putting your power and your authority together, but actually spreading that so that there's more, it's a more conversational and more inclusive way forward with more perspectives being heard. But yeah, I think thanks both of you for summarising what we talked about. It was a really great discussion.
Thank you. Tony, do you have anything to add?
No, nothing to add. Let's go on to the next group.
Okay, yeah. The next group is breakout room 3, and that only had 3 people in it: Blanche, Graham and Martha.
We had Kylie as well, actually. There were 4 of us.
I don't think it'd be fair for me to distill it all, because I felt that all 3 other speakers had such amazing ideas and are using some of the ideas that were coming out of the session in their own lives in a practical way. I was really inspired by the optimism, and one thing that we did look at is what, like the first group was looking at, the tension between being active now and pausing to have time to contemplate. And this was something that, you know, Graham was talking about, and we're all sort of looking there. So, and to do something creative in the space. But I think really it would be fair for us all to have a very quick little feedback on what was being said, rather than me trying to summarize it all.
Sure. Okay. So I was jotting down some words that came up, and it was really community and relationship that was sort of a consistent idea, and place-based activities, Indigenous knowledge. And I have a personal realization that I've come to in the past, say, year, that as a designer with a sense of urgency and more of an activist mind, working with farmers, I've realized that it needs to be both. We need to have the urgency of an activist tempered by the patience of a farmer. So that's sort of what I'm trying to practice. But no, I don't want to, so I'm presenting sort of my view, but yeah, I would like to pass on to either Graham or Blanche to add their thoughts and their recollection of what we covered.
All right. I started off by being the one of the 4 members who was left in uncertainty by last week's roundtable, between Amanda, whom I tended to sympathise with, let's do something now, let's do something with what we know, being an old delegate myself, and Tyson and Nora unravelling our thinking. And I took the point to heart that really you mustn't rush into action on the basis of old certainties which have proved partly helpful or sometimes quite unhelpful. And I was grateful to the other 3 members for reminding me that there were still things we did know, and there was still action that we could be doing right now. Thanks.
Great summary, everyone. I just wanted to add that, you know, I entered the conversation, you don't know how much you know until you open your mouth, or how much you don't know, and then something beautiful happens in the synthesis of everyone just chipping in a little bit. And it's a very awakening sort of experience / opportunity. And certainly, yeah, the key things that stood out for me in our shares were relationship and the value of that, and community. And yes, Graham ended it with the sort of sense of perhaps being comfortable with not knowing, and then we sort of segued into, well, what bodies of knowledge do we hold as well? So yeah, that's probably enough for me. Thank you.
So group 4, Donnelly, Janice, Joe, and Catherine.
I can speak to the, I'd like others to jump in as well though. We had really quite a lovely conversation which went in lots of different directions which also mentioned my teacher, the octopus, which was great. It was interesting that the very last, like we grabbed this little tail of a question on the way out that I might start with, which was how do we facilitate installing the crimes against nature that's being kind of created in the UN? Is that right, Donna? In the UN right now, they're creating these genocide or ecocide.
Groups in the EU are looking to create laws that you can prosecute for, you know, environmental crimes and crimes against nature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think all of us had a recognition, a relationship with Sand Talk, which was great to bring that forward, and an understanding that the learning that's taking place there is still, it can perhaps gets trapped in the words. Maybe we need more of the visions, like the Sand Talk. I described my experience of Sand Talk. I needed to write the actual images. I needed to draw the images myself so that I could see them and experience them, because that helped me to learn them. And I think it was Joe who suggested perhaps in the roundtables we could have, I don't know if you've ever seen somebody do the like an image-based reflection of the words being spoken. I've seen that in a couple of groups that I've done vision work with, where there's one person who's got, you know, bored, someone trying to synthesize in image what's being spoken in word. And I think that would maybe assist us, because it's systems thinking. There's so many levels of our human capacity that we're capable of perceiving and understanding from. And I think the image realm needs to be included in that, and capacity that it actually draws on, and pun intended. Yeah, Joe, maybe you want to speak a little bit further on that one.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, what was really interesting, reflecting on the roundtable, was just the use of metaphors. And even when we're talking here, the use of metaphors is super powerful in explaining how we're thinking and how things fit together. I guess for me, it's always really interesting to think about how we might be able to express those things non-verbally. So drawing, sketching, acting, feeling, moving. So there might be a bit more room for that sort of thinking as well. Yeah, but I might throw it over to the other team members to see where they're at as well.
The conversation also went to when to act, how to act, and how the perspective of, you know, being outraged at some of the injustices, and how like when is action positive, when is not being active. And so we talked about being you know, connected to earth, the perspective of the human-centric perspective, the projection of belief systems, etc., onto all things rather than being informed by nature. And again, round the documentary, My Octopus Teacher, is how nature is a great capacity to inform and to act from that rather than from the perspective, the intellect, etc. So when activism can be successful is when you bring in all of those elements, I suppose. So that was just another piece that we added to the discussion.
I think you three have done a great job. Thank you. I don't think I have any more to add.
Great. Thanks, Janice. So breakout group 5 was Chris, Susanna, Natalia, and Robin.
So we also started with the conversation around the tension of the action and inaction, that movement that needing to move forward, and we reflected upon the value of pausing and the significance of, while it may appear that there's inaction, that actually doesn't really reflect the activity of the individual who is taking the time to pause, and the importance of giving the attentional space to that, so that instead of jumping into action, we're actually in the reflective mode, and the value of looking at implicit assumptions. We also talked actually quite a lot about a discussion around power and authority, and how was that sitting with us, and what were the systems of power that we were familiar with. And I brought in the question, if we began to think about power in a different way in terms of energy, rather than that sense of power, what it is by the system of power that we may be associating with the systems of learning we've had, which more generally connects us to systems of either direct violence or structural violence. So what is it in terms of a power over rather than a relationship with? So even just thinking about using a word in that sense of what is energy, and how might we image that and the relationship to organic movements of energy. Something that we didn't talk about so much, but I think is valuable to bring in, is the value of thinking about the pedagogy of land. What is it that, and that means the whole teaching that's available to us in terms of the processes that are forever in change in land and our relationship to land. So I don't think we reached any specific conclusion or particular question, but we certainly generated a lot of thought and reflection around those general questions and areas of concern.
Thank you, Karen. And yes, Susan has summed it up pretty well. But also, as I was listening to the summaries of conversations from other groups, yeah, I think it just the main difference for me between sort of civilized people, well, people living in civilized worlds, and people, indigenous people, is the level of connection to land. And indigenous people seem to be, well, not seem to be, they are much more connected to land and much more tuned to what's going on with the land, and that's where their wisdom comes from. And it is with the discussion that we had about the importance of pause, I think is something that we might learn from indigenous people, how to tune with nature and how to sense that pause timing, when to start and when to stop, when it's time to pause and when it's time to act, like in action, not action by pausing. That's one thing that I thought about, and another, which is to pick up that suggestion from the previous group about the importance of expressing ourselves not only in terms of language, but in using other means, and images probably is the first thing that comes to mind. And if it's possible, I don't know whether it's doable, but scribing along the conversation during the main session, the next one, would be really interesting. And if there would be an indigenous scriber available to come along, it would be just fantastic, because it would be just a unique perspective, reflecting in indigenous way, in indigenous images, reflecting on the conversation that is going on.
I think most of it's been said, but just a bit more on the attention between sort of action and whatever the other is. We were sort of talked about, in a sense, we need to extend the notion of action, perhaps even slow action down. We've talked about the pause, but somehow the notion that talking and language, particularly language that includes metaphor, is also a form of action. And it's also a form of change. You know, every time we speak in different ways, every time we use different metaphors, in a sense, we are changing the way we see the world. So perception is a form, or the continuing flow of different forms of perception is a form of action too. And it's the same with attention, you know, that Suzanne has already talked about as well, that attention itself is also a form of action. It's a form of changing our relationship to the other or to the world. So perhaps somehow I want to stretch, I want to stretch action somehow. I'm doing this with my hands. I want to, it's like turning all nouns into verbs, you know, so everything gets sort of stretched a bit. I suppose the other thing, and I think it's difficult to know what we talked about or what I imagined in my head, that all action is part of a context, and so we can never just act. I mean, acting will always require these other contexts, of which language, thinking, and so on is a part. So I suppose I want to somehow hold that tension in a different way. And power, again, spent a lot of time, as already been indicated, talking about power, and that one of the worst aspects of power is, in fact, it can hold us in a kind of an hallucinatory state, particularly structural power, which we take so for granted that we can't even see that power is being exercised. So that to inquire into that form of power seemed to be really important too, as well as our own personal, the ability of us as individuals to act powerfully.
I think the question that struck me was when we were talking about stick insects in the earlier session, it's not only the political and economic structures around us that trap us, but it's also the assumptions underlying those, the assumptions we make about money and teaching and learning and power and authority. So there's a whole area almost slightly deeper than that, which I wouldn't want to forget. And I think that leads into everything everyone else in my group has said, and others.
So group 6 is Tobias, Fran, Chris, and Che.
I think that may have fallen on my lap. We were actually really, Tobias was really generous and shared some knowledge he had around the power of yarning. And so introduced or gave us we had a bit of a yarning approach of conversing by telling stories and passing it on, which was a really nice and very disarming way to go through the issues. And so interestingly, actually, everyone in our group shared quite a lot of personal interactions, and in fact, I guess a privilege of knowledge that they'd been recipients of from First Nations people here in Australia. So that was a pretty strong theme in our discussion. And we were looking at actually potentially the unique privilege that we have here in Australia is how can we in Australia take that knowledge that we've potentially got closer access to try and go through some of these adaptive learnings through transition. So the two questions that I think the way I'd summarize it, and I'm keen to hear the feedback from the rest of the group of how well this summarizes what we looked at, but two of the questions that we came up with that we coalesced around, one was how do we handle the language? So as settlers, when we're talking about things like connecting to country, how do we as settlers not sort of trespass on cultural appropriation? So there's some danger around taking that knowledge and doing so respectfully. And so how do we go about doing that in a way that's respectful? Which was, I guess, a question we'd be interested to put to the panel. And then in a way, following on from that, how can I guess it stemmed from, I actually sort of vulnerably put the question out, how can I sort of connect with my Aboriginality? But then we sort of discussed how we as settlers might be able to transition our identity. How do we relate to that knowledge? And it actually went back to Tyson mentioned this transition of moving from the Indigenous people saying, how do we get our land back, to a different headspace, which might be, how do we connect the settlers to the land so they live under Aboriginal law? So the question that we had in response to that was how can we take settlers so that their self-identity could actually be more closely related with Aboriginality and Aboriginal culture and the Aboriginal connection within ourselves, more than our identity as citizens of a constitutional monarchy. Could we flip over so that becomes our preeminent identity? And how can we do that?
I realise that we're a little bit time for, and I think Chris did a really great job summarising it. I guess where I come from, I'm really interested in how to build the bridge to bring people across. Is it okay if I share my screen just for 1 second?
Sure.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
I'll just
see if you can. I might have to give you permission.
Can you see
no,
that?
It's working. Is everyone seeing it? Yeah.
Can you see a screen with a slide on it, like a PowerPoint?
Mm-hmm. I can.
So this was directly in relation to that concept of how do we make this bridge, and I think that it's really important. So on this slide we've got a European food forest, and we've got Indigenous Europeans from Britain, and I think my point was we need to bring people back to our common, where we were all the same. So we all had the same laws and the same responsibilities for our country. So rather than looking at the differences, saying what point of time were we all the same, and how can we pick up those laws and bring them with us? And then the next question is, how do we then take those and then also bring upon us the laws from the new place where we are? So this is an Indigenous food forest, an Indigenous person from where I live, and then combining those together. So looking at all completely common ground with the vision of not being a parasite any longer, of all helping each other out and coming from the same place, I guess. All right, I'll stop my share now.
Sorry, yeah, I'll throw in my 2 cents worth and started. I mean, we already onto the things we kind of asked ourselves how to go about the change in the big picture, and now we're doing it already by coming together and sharing our insights, and that was very powerful in our group too, to observe, like, and after the initial roundtable, similar to what I said before, there was this sense of uncertainty. I posed the question of where does the agency lie, and yeah, then it just emerged by itself through sharing our insights and sharing our stories. So that's what yeah, my input was there in terms of the power of our own stories and sharing our stories. And so yeah, through this the yarning process, similar to what we do now here in this online space, sharing our knowledge. And yeah, it was just good to observe now in the bigger picture too, to see other people presenting their emergent knowledge as well. And it's like, to me, it's the change in action, if you like. And yeah, good to share knowledge in that way. And so yeah, the other 2 people already summed it up very nicely. So I'll pass it on to Fran for the final words. And
don't have anything to add because I think everyone summarised it so beautifully. So thank you.
Great. So the final group is Karen, Nikki, Peter and Robin.
Perhaps I'll lead off, and I'd just like to first reflect on what a rich
process of reporting back this been, and how many synergies there's been between this, what has gone on in each of the groups, and as we come back. And so I think what I'd like to begin with is we had a fairly organic process in our group. The yarn just kind of shared and went on and around, so we didn't come up with any specific sort of responses to your questions, Kenneth, but it was nevertheless a really rich conversation. And we started with the luminal space that we're all finding ourselves in at the moment, and really that question of how do we be in that space. And this led us into this tension and relational connectedness between knowing and being and doing, which has come up in some of the other groups so strongly. And we talked in various ways with different stories around this idea of being and this relationship in terms of being with nature, and then imagining ourselves in terms of being as aspects of nature. And the question of rights came up with this, the rights of the river came up, and equivalent. So that connected with something in another group. And then as being a good ancestor and the rights of the future. So the kind of, you've got the being and the doing as being totally intertwined, but absolutely connected as well with knowing, which seems to be that kind of imagining and listening. So I think that was kind of really what most came up for us that I can remember, but I'll hand it over now to to one of the others. I won't pick on you.
Peter, do you want to pick it up from there?
Well, I think, Karen, you've described very well what happened in that. All I could add was there was some discussion around that Tyson idea of the 1,000-year cleanup, which I think is a fascinating idea and difficult. It's difficult enough to provide for our children or grandchildren, ideas that might help, but to think of some sort of 1,000-year process, or getting some structure around that, even in thought or feeling or something. That's what I'll stay with. Thank you.
I'll just reiterate what both Karen and Peter have said. I think the conversation was beautiful. It was very organic, and I really loved that it just evolved and emerged in that kind of way. I think that the things that really stood out to me, and the things that I made some big notes about in front of me, were the two big questions: how do we be, and what if we just listened? And I think this idea about how do we be a good ancestor? How do we be like a river? How do we be in community? How do we be considerate of what happens in 1,000 years' time? All of these kinds of things I think, as Karen said, it was a really rich conversation, which is always wonderful and surprising and beautiful when it happens between four strangers that are no longer strangers. So how wonderful to now have a relationship with 3 other people around some of these really incredible ideas. So I'm very grateful to everyone from the group and for the opportunity to join today. So thank you.
Thank you to the group. I think you've all summarised what we talked about very well. I'd only add that if we'd had another half hour, we would have perhaps got to the question a little further of what is being demanded of us? What are the systems change that we're being required to listen to, that are calling for the knowing, the doing and the being around those? So yeah, that's one of the questions before us, I think, is what are the systems demanding change in our times? But thank you.
Thanks, Robin. I'd just like to throw in a couple of things for you to think about. One is about the group itself. From today through to the next roundtable and then the forum after that, there's two things that I want to suggest that you might consider doing. One is keeping a journal, to just a journal that's just for your own benefit, but just to continue working on these thoughts. The journal might be, it depends on what comes easy to you or what comes naturally to you. The journal might be, you know, a more traditional kind of journal where you write something every day, like your daily pages, or it might be just sketches and jotted down thoughts that come to you when you wake up in the morning, or when you're having a shower, or when you're going for a walk, just so that you capture them and hold them and can enrich the conversation with those reflections. And the second one is I'll send out an email to everyone asking you for your permission to share your emails with one another, so that we can start to create a sense of a collegiate undertaking here, that we're on a journey together and we are building on one another's experience and knowledge and creative thinking. So those are two suggestions that I want to make. And finally, I just wanted to mention something which I think is really encouraging and which you might find useful. One of the remnants of British colonialism is a thing called the Commonwealth of Nations, which used to be called the British Commonwealth, and now, as that quite a number of the countries that are part of the Commonwealth no longer accept the Queen as their head of state. It's now called the Commonwealth of Nations. And one of the things that's been initiated out of the Commonwealth of Nations is the notion that the member states of the Commonwealth should start to develop what they've been calling regenerative roadmaps. Not just sustainability, not just the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but regenerative roadmaps. And it probably will come as no surprise to you to hear that the Australian government has shown nil interest in this. The New Zealand government has opened up some interest in New Zealand, but here, nothing, nil. So a group of people were formed to start to look at how can this be pursued as a kind of grassroots thing in Australia. And the interesting thing that came out of a series of discussions around that was that the people involved said, while Australia might be a nation state, that's a colonial imposition. Australia was actually a continent of more than 300 cultural groups that had their own traditions, their own ceremonies, their own stories, and lived largely peacefully on this continent. That's the basis on which we should be developing a regenerative roadmap for Australia. It should be very place-based. It should be informed by country. It should be informed by the stories of country. And therefore the process should be led by Indigenous people. They shouldn't just be asked to participate. It should be led by them. So a group of about 20 people that formed a kind of working group on this is now led by about 6 or 8 Indigenous leaders from around the country. And they're the ones who are basically not just leading, but teaching us as we go forward and think about how does this initiative start to unfold in Australia. And for me, I think that's one of the most encouraging and inspiring things that I know of that's happening. There are many things that are happening in this country, as all around the world, that are really important. But that's one of the ones that at a heart level feels like one of the most significant initiatives, certainly in Australia. So I offer those as some thoughts on how we approach this process of thinking through change. How do we learn to be more skillful in our approach to change? And how do we transmit those learnings through our networks over a much wider audience than those of us participating in these roundtables?
Kenneth?
Yes, Karen.
Yeah, look, just a question actually on this last point you made around this regenerative roadmaps, which I also found extremely inspiring, and I was unaware of it actually. I was unaware of the Commonwealth of Nations sort of instigating this idea, and I just wonder if there's some material about this and what is happening in Australia that you're able to share with us. You know, this because this idea of it coming from our at country level nations just is absolutely beautiful, and very much something that I could see being a really good way for us to respond to your last question, is how do we transmit this to a wider audience? Is, you know, it's this being and doing thing that we could start doing. It just really inspired me what you said then. So I just wondered if there's something you can share with us that can perhaps then come into our next conversation next time.
Well, there isn't right now, Karen, because it's still very much in a kind of working group stage.
Okay.
So you know, things like making that shift away from the notion of the nation state to the cultural identity rooted and based in the land.
Yes.
And another thing was the people involved said, we don't like this term roadmap. That's not appropriate in this country. So the Indigenous elders who are involved are saying, well, perhaps the term we should use is the Australian regenerative songlines. And so they're consulting with their colleagues, and is it appropriate to use this term songlines in this context? And we're waiting to hear what they say, whether they think that's appropriate or whether it's a kind of expropriation of their culture. So yeah, it's proceeding, but it's proceeding at the pace it needs to go at, I guess.
Yeah.
And hopefully by the time of the next forum, I might be able to report something more to you on this. Any other comments or questions?
Yes,
I would just like,
sorry.
I would just like to, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Sheila.
I would just like to reiterate to you, Kenneth, what Karen has just said.
Good. Okay. Good. Thank you, Sheila. And Julie.
Yeah, I can feel that emergence of that sense of, oh, there's something happening, let's just grab, which is really beautiful. My question, I had something similar to Karen that I wanted to ask. Rather, can you, if you're involved with the groups, rather than think you have to report, you know, and so therefore you become an add-on adjunction,
why not offer to the Indigenous group is there a question that they would like us to sit with, or something that we could pose with, as opposed to us coming up with our own questions and then going backwards and forwards? Is there any way that we as a body could be of value and of service to explore things that, so in other words, they're already starting a system inside themselves that's linking in, but we can be on outside ears and outside eyes by exploring questions, not necessarily coming up with answers or results or things that have to be done, but just exploring questions, and they get to hear something from the outside.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a very, very valuable suggestion, I think, and I'll certainly share that with other people involved and see what their response is. Any other comments? Tobias?
Yeah, Kenneth, I was just wondering if there's a space for people to share resources, or even outside or within this space platform where people can collaborate who wish to do so in terms of taking next step actions and coming out of this space where people can form their own little initiatives, and but particularly more a place for sharing resources, like what Shay was putting on with the PowerPoint, for example, that rather than sending it out as an email to everybody, that there's a place where people can share it and access it themselves.
Well, there is. The Anthropos in Transition Network set up when the COVID rolled over us. We set up an online platform to allow people who were engaged in our programs to share. And I'll send an invitation to everyone to join that. It's called the Anthropos in Transition Hub. And within that, there's, it'll take a little while for you to just explore the site and work out for yourself how it works. But there's a series of discussion rooms, and those discussion rooms can either be open or closed. So some of them are closed because we've got, for example, we've got 2 ongoing dialogue groups, and they're groups with a kind of continuity of their own. So their discussion rooms are closed because it's only people in the dialogue groups. So we can set up something similar for this learning change initiative, if you'd find that useful. So I'll include that in the email that I'll send you in the next within the next week. So thank you very much, everyone. It's been a great privilege to meet you all, and I look forward to it next time.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Kenneth.
Thank you. Bye.
It was excellent.
Bye.
Bye.